Okay, so we are in our unit tackling the ideas around how to teach our English language learners to read in English in ways that are really effective. Obviously, with enough time and enough persuasion and enough effort, probably almost anything can eventually lead students to be successful with reading in English, but that's not what we're here to learn. You, just like I was when I was a new teacher, want to know what are the tricks. What are the things that we know so far that will really amplify our efforts so that we're immediately successful. So what I've titled this lecture is How to Structure an Effective Reading Lesson. So with the last time that we were together for this course, what we did was we took a look at what does second language acquisition research tell us about the ideas that we need to bring with us when we shape our reading lessons. And today I'm going to kind of highlight the big pieces that you as a new teacher, as a developing teacher, can grab onto to kind of see how you might shape your lessons, okay? So there's a lot more details that we'll learn over time, and for those of you who go on to the spring course, Supporting Second Language Literacy, we'll take a look at some other issues as well. But this is really about the big picture, the big pieces that you can pack in your bag and take, and even if you begin teaching reading next week, you've got something to start with. Okay, a couple of fun, I love history, or if you didn't already, now you do. And a couple of quick little fun facts. Some people, including Michel Foucault, a writer that I very much appreciate, believe that when people began to be able to read, so when populations in the medieval times slowly began to learn to read, that was actually the beginning of childhood. Because before the skill of reading, before literacy, adults and children led basically the same lives. They did the same work together, they did the same activities together. What adults knew, children knew, and what children knew, adults knew, and so it was the same. But with the skill of reading, suddenly adults and children had access to different information, and that was the birth of childhood. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Michel Foucault and some others have said as well. Another fun fact, up until I think the early 1850s, it was considered rude to read in front of others. And I'm not sure exactly the reasons, but I can guess that it might have been kind of seen as showing off. I don't know. Anyways, okay, but that's not what we're here for today. We're here to talk about the big pieces that you need to take with you in how to structure a reading lesson. So I'll give a lecture, and then I've got some readings, some videos, and I'll talk about those after this, and some readings from the chapter that I think will add to this, flesh it out, say it to you in a different way, show it to you, that kind of thing. And then where we're headed is you will watch a 30-minute clip, about 30 minutes, from a teacher at Eastern Washington University, Christina Guilfoyle. You'll watch a 30-minute excerpt from one of her reading classes. And then you'll analyze it, see what you notice. What is she doing? How does that fit, like, for example, into this big picture? And then meet us in the discussion, and let's talk about what you see. That's a key way that teachers move forward, to watch someone teach and then talk about what you notice. Okay. So just very quickly, let's take a look at what I've got on the board here, and then I'll start walking through. I've got pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading. I've got purpose, text, and students. I've got scaffolded reading experiences, also known as SREs. And I've got a list of underused approaches, jigsaws, think alouds, context clues, reading strategies, teaching grammar from patterns. And then I've got two issues listed here, questions and appropriate reading material for beginners. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that you really need, and the thing that will probably, of everything else I say, have the biggest impact on your instruction, is whenever you are giving an intensive reading lesson. Now remember, in the last lecture we talked about the difference between intensive and extensive reading. Very quickly, extensive reading, it's at or below your students' reading level. You're not supporting them at all, or maybe just a little bit, but very little. And they are larger amounts of reading than you tackle in the classroom. Maybe in the classroom you're tackling one paragraph at a time with your students. But for extensive reading outside, either because you're asking them to or they're doing it on their own, they might be tackling a page a night of extensive reading. So we're not talking about extensive reading, we're talking about intensive, which means it's above your students' reading level, and you are supporting them with it. It is what you are teaching them with in the classroom. So that's what we're talking about. So when you're doing that, the piece that is going to make the biggest impact on you, if you haven't figured this out already, you need to think about it in terms of 3 steps. What you do with the students before they read, how you set up their dream reading experiences, and then what you do with them afterwards. Okay? So the thing to think about with pre-reading is that you are setting the students up for success. You're setting them up for success with this text. Now, what we know from the last lecture is that it should be interactive, right? It should be both top-down and bottom-up, the ways that you are supporting them. So, for example, with pre-reading, you are supporting them top-down by talking about the author's purpose or getting them to notice or guess about the author's purpose. You would also, with pre-reading, be supporting them with bottom-up. So you might be picking out some key vocabulary items and making sure that the students have access to those meanings. That might be because you teach those vocabulary. That might be because you have the students guess about them and look to see if they see any clues about what they mean. It might be that you point out the glossary that's along the side of the page. So there's lots of different ways of supporting students, but what we know is before they are tackling that text, you need to be working with them, setting them up for success. Think about it this way: when you're talking with them before they do the reading, it's like you're on a surface street and here's the freeway. And you've got to build that on-ramp for them to get on the freeway. That's really what pre-reading is. And so we've got this idea of an on-ramp, and we've got this idea that it needs to be top-down and bottom-up. Now, one thing that I have done at times with pre-reading is to actually give my students a reading on the same topic that's below or closer to their level. So sometimes pre-reading is reading, but often, usually, it involves a mixture of listening and speaking, and sometimes some writing too. What might a pre-reading writing activity might be? It might be that you ask the students to spend 1 minute looking over the reading, just looking in any way they want, maybe looking at the pictures, looking at any words that catch their attention, looking at the first sentence of a paragraph, and then closing the reading and for 5 minutes writing about their predictions, right? So sometimes pre-reading looks like reading. But I want you to know that for most of us, most of the time, pre-reading is a mixture of listening and speaking. And one thing that you will probably struggle with, especially early in your career, but I think all of us as good teachers struggle with it throughout our career, is when you look at the balance of listening and speaking, you want your students speaking more. It's really difficult when you think to yourself all that your students need to know, and you're very tempted to just tell them. And to, if you have 20 minutes for pre-reading, you spend 17 minutes of that speaking yourself. But if you stop and think about it, there are other ways to access pre-reading ideas other than just you speaking. You could put students into groups. You could divide up the questions and have them tackle what those things are. If there are certain keywords that you think are so important that students know before they do the pre-reading, what if you divide students up into 6 groups and each group gets one of those keywords and the definition, and they themselves tackle it? What does it really mean? And they put it into student language, and then with the rest of your pre-reading time, they are teaching the rest of the class. So be smart about it. Work smart. It's not just about your students listening. It's not just about you sharing information. Think about how your students can take part in that and take on part of that labor. So ideally, pre-reading would be a combination of listening and speaking, a true combination, not just you speaking most of the time and then them answering a little bit, and reading and writing. But most of the time it's a mixture of listening and speaking. Okay? So now we have this idea that simply tossing your students a reading and saying, read it for tomorrow and waving goodbye is not going to work. Really, for any students who struggle in any way with reading, but for your English language learners, they really need access. They really need that on-ramp, both that top-down and that bottom-up support. And now we know that I'm expecting you to make it interactive, to use as many of the skills as you can to support them. Okay? And then the idea of during reading. So you might be thinking, what is there you can do during reading? Students simply read. But when you start to think about the different ways that reading plays out, you start to realize that there's a lot of options there. And when you think about the ways that you could mark up text for your students, you realize there's a lot of options there. So with during reading, your students may be reading it aloud to themselves. They might be reading it silently to themselves. You might be reading it to them as they're looking at their text. So there's a lot of options there. Or you might have pre-recorded and uploaded on a site that students have access to, or old-fashioned if you're teaching overseas and students still have like tape recorders, the old-fashioned tape recorders. You might be taping yourself and then having them listen to that as they follow along with their text. So there's a lot of options there. And also for during reading, there's a lot of options about how they are actually reading the text. It could just be everyone's reading exactly the same text, but it might be that for either all of your English language learners or students, English language learners that are a lower level, it could be, for example, that you have gone through and underlined the absolutely key sentences. Or maybe you've gone through and next to each paragraph you've written the main idea and you've instructed the students, read the main idea, then read the paragraph, then return to the main idea, and make sure that that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, reread the paragraph, right? So that would be a way to do it. You might also create a reader's guide. A reader's guide is usually a series of questions and they match up chronologically with the text. So it's not necessarily that it says, look at paragraph 4, line 7, sentence 3, but if students are able to answer question 4, they know they need to read farther down into the text to answer question 5. So you could create something like that. All of those things are scaffolds. If you are headed off to teach in K through 12, you might have a classroom, let's say you're teaching 4th grade, you might have a classroom of 28, and of those 28, 14 students are native speakers and they don't struggle with reading at all, okay? And of the other 14, all of those students struggle in some way with reading. Maybe some because they're simply struggling with literacy development. They're native speakers, but they're struggling with that. Or maybe because they're English language learners. So one thing you can think about is scaffolding within even, say, your 4th grade classroom. If you have a mixture of different students, different proficiencies, different access to English, giving them different kinds of scaffolding. But if you're headed off to teach adults, they will probably be divided by proficiency level, and they will probably all be English language learners, in which case you're probably all giving them a scaffold to use the first time or the second time or the third time. One thing to know is that you need to think during reading, you need to think about how difficult the text is. Now, in general, if we're doing an intensive reading with students, in general, it's I+1, okay? Now, if it's I+1, in general, you would read it a minimum of 3 times with students, or asking them to read it a minimum of 3 times. So that's something to think about. It might be that you are putting a text in front of students, and it just happens that this is actually right at their level. Would you need to read it 3 times? Probably not. But in general, I'd like you to kind of take away, just like I've said, there are 3 parts to a reading lesson, to tackling a reading, even if it takes place over several course meetings. There are also probably 3 times that you'll have students return to the reading. And it could be that first time we're all together and you're reading it aloud to them and they're following along. That could be the first time. So it doesn't all have to be homework. It doesn't all have to be outside of class time. And we know from our last lecture that it's really important that you give students a purpose every single time they read. So if you are putting an I+1 reading in front of students, so it's just slightly above their reading level, their language level, and you have them read it first, and then second, and then for a third time, you wouldn't give them exactly the same purpose each time. The first time the purpose might be read this text, it's describing a problem, and it's also suggesting 2 solutions. So I want you to read it and see if you can identify what the problem is, and if possible, see if you can identify what those 2 possible solutions are. Maybe the second time you have them read, what you're reading for is you're reading for what are the inferences. The author is giving some suggestions that of why these solutions might not work. And find where the author talks about that, identify that. Then maybe with the third read, maybe for the third read, you have students focusing on the language. So if this is a text that's describing a problem and possible solutions, maybe with the students you go over what are some of the key words that we use in English? What's that really useful vocabulary when we're describing a problem and possible solutions? Maybe you, as a group, you come up with a list. Everybody goes home with that list. And for the third time they read, they're looking for that vocabulary and to see how it's used. Then when they come back to class, everyone is comparing what they found. And maybe that would be perfectly setting them up to write a text themselves in which they're using that vocabulary. They're writing in such a way. What's a problem? What are some possible solutions? And so during reading is followed by post-reading. Now, if you're having the students read 3 times, you might, with more advanced students, say, okay, I want you to read it 3 times. First time, just read it for the main ideas. Second time, I want you to answer the questions in this question guide. Third time, I want you to find a sentence that you think our class should discuss tomorrow. So maybe for more advanced students, you're telling them to read it all 3 times, read for different purposes. Then they come back into class. Now you're doing the post-reading. But for most of us, most of the time, We're not doing it that way. You might assign the students to read the text for the first time, just reading for the main ideas. They go home, they do that, they come back. Now you're doing some post-reading. And then you assign them to read it the second time with a question guide. You come back. Now you're going to pick out those key questions that really get at the deeper level of what the text is about and how it works. And then that would probably be your post-reading. So it's slightly more complicated than I've made it look here, because I've made it look like you do pre-reading with a text, students read it, they come back and you do the post-reading. But it might look more like a cycle. If students are reading it 3 times, then you would actually do this cycle 3 times possibly in your class time with the students, with your instruction. But really, these are the key things you need to hold on to. You can use this, apply it to any reading lesson that you carry out. Now, one thing I want to say about post-reading is that post-reading, when I was first taught to teach reading, I was told that with post-reading, one of the things we often do is we take the text apart and then we put it back together again. And I've been chewing on those ideas all these years, and I'm still thinking through them. But it's true. Often with post-reading, what we're doing is we're telling students, hey, there's a part of this reading that really focuses on this issue. With your group, find that. And what told you that that was the correct place? So with that, you would be kind of zeroing in on one certain part of the reading. And then you're constantly coming back to how does it fit into the whole thing? So you're taking it apart, you're zeroing in on these little pieces, and then you're putting it back together again. One kind of clear way to think about taking it apart, putting it back together again, is to retell it orally as a group. So if you, for example, are reading a narrative, a story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, whether it's realistic or it's a fable, whatever it is, you could, for example, work with students on the language that we use when we're telling a story to connect ideas together. First, after that, then that kind of language, finally. And so you could go around the room and have students retell that story orally. Or it could happen in writing as well, retelling, writing a summary of the article, synthesizing the article, that kind of thing. So taking it apart, putting it back together again. Often our taking it apart is kind of getting our hands into that reading, just like we're the writer, and seeing what kinds of choices the author made. If the author used lots of lists, why? Why did the author make that choice? If the author uses lots of certain kinds of connecting language, why did the author do that? Maybe the author uses lots of questions. Why? Maybe the author uses lots of exclamations, so a sentence with an exclamation point at the end. Why? Why did the author do that? So zeroing in on certain pieces, which often tend to be, they don't have to be, but they often tend to be grammatical structures, grammatical competency, can be part of taking it apart again. Post-reading, just like pre-reading, is rich with listening and speaking. And again, especially with post-reading, if you're doing more of the talking, you're doing it wrong. You need to find a way that the students can carry part of that burden, and you can turn out that work to them to take it apart and put it back together again. It's with post-reading, if you would come into someone's post-reading work, you would often see students working with partner, working with a small group or a larger group, that kind of thing. Okay. So now we have kind of the structure for how to organize our reading lesson for English language learners. How do we know which activities to choose, what to focus in on? There are 3 aspects that we consider when we're thinking about what to focus on in pre-reading, or what kind of post-reading to do, or how many times to have the students read the text. Purpose, text, and the students themselves. So one thing that you need to think about is, why am I having students read this text? And it doesn't just connect with the level of the text. So, for example, so I said that if you're having students read a text that's I+1 or above, you will usually have them read it 3 times. Well, there's some exceptions. Like I have with my own students in the past, if I'm getting them ready in pre-reading to read a certain kind of genre, and I'm prepping them with discourse competence, so I'm teaching them how this genre works, and maybe eliciting, so I'm not just speaking, eliciting ideas from the students about how that genre works, and then maybe we make some predictions about the kind of language that might happen in a text like that. I have, for example, given out an excerpt of the same genre that maybe is the students, way above the students' level. But my purpose is not to read and absorb and completely comprehend the text, but rather to take a look and see, were our predictions right? That's all we're doing. We're looking quickly, are our predictions right? And so that would be an example of a purpose of a text that would tell me, I'm only going to read it once. I'm not going to read it carefully. I'm not going to have them read it carefully. And the pre-reading would be simply saying to them, okay, we're going to take a quick look at this. Move your eye carefully, quickly over the page, looking for any evidence that we were right in our predictions. So that would really control the pre-reading. And the post-reading would be around that purpose. So were we right? Let's circle some places in this handout where we were right. Where were we wrong? And what would it say if we were wrong? That kind of thing. So think about your purpose for the text. Sometimes you may put texts in front of students that are I+1 or above, and the focus is just to enjoy the text. It's just to enjoy it. So maybe when your students are coming into class, getting settled, maybe you're teaching a K through 12 class, or you're teaching a reading class, and you want your students doing additional reading, but you really want them also to be exposed to how wonderful reading text can be. So maybe you make it a habit of yours that as students are coming in and getting out their materials, getting out their books, getting settled, up on the overhead, you've got a brief poem, or you've got a famous quote that's just beautiful, or you've got a paragraph describing something that's just lovely. And students are getting settled, and they know once they have their materials out, they need to look up, and they know that the only purpose is just to enjoy, right? So your purpose may not be to get in there, tackle the text, comprehend everything. You might have other purposes for exposing them to reading, so just think about that. You also look at the text itself when you're making decisions about pre-reading, during reading, post-reading, how many times to read, what to focus on, what to have the students doing with the text, how to support them with the text. And there are 2 things that I think about when I think about the text. The first is, this text is a unique text. Unless the author plagiarized it, and there's other versions out there, you have to assume this text is a unique text. And this author is a unique author. So what about this text is different? What does it call for? Maybe it's full of vocabulary that are really difficult, or maybe not. Maybe it has incredibly clear topic sentences, but the rest of the paragraph is really difficult to wade through. So think, how is this text different? Maybe it's a compare-contrast text, and the first 3 paragraphs are compare, and the last 3 paragraphs are contrast. And so just notice how this text works. Notice how it ticks, right? And those are the things you want to put in front of your students, whether you're teaching, whether you're getting them to notice, whatever it is that you're doing, you would want them to notice those, especially when you think about your English language learners. You want them to notice the things that could trip them up. They could be challenges, things that you can prep them with, you can support them with, that otherwise, without you, without that support, they may not get to comprehension. But there's another aspect of the text I think about as well, and that is, what are some things I can exploit about how this text works that are true about a lot of other texts in this genre? So let's say that you put a compare-contrast text in front of the students, and it uses really typical compare-contrast language. Things like likewise, similarly, connectors like that. Let's see, unlike, it uses the word unlike. It uses a lot of but language. Not but you know what I mean, and or but. And so you can take advantage of those things, point them out, and bonus, bonus, you can say to your students, whenever you are reading compare-contrast, whether it's in biology, whether it's in history, whether it's in psychology, whatever it is, it's going to look like this. And you can kind of point it out to them so that they can take that with them in the future. So 2 aspects of text that I think about that help me make decisions about what activities to choose. And then think about the students themselves. Both think in terms of the resources that they bring, the background knowledge that they bring, and what gaps exist. So first, the positive, the background knowledge, the resources. What is it that they've already learned previously or that they have experienced in their own home lives, in their previous schooling, from their own kind of common sense way of seeing the world, whether that's through mainstream U.S. culture or their own minority cultural view? Whatever that is, how can you kind of already put the wind in their back so that they are going to be especially successful with this text? So you're connecting them with the text, connecting what they already know with the text. And for the other aspect, what might challenge them? What are some gaps that they might experience that would be between them and being successful with the text? So is there a lot of vocabulary that they haven't already learned? Are there some concepts that they won't understand what meaning they have, at least in this context? What assumptions does the author make that the students might not be able to follow the author? If these are newly arrived students and it's a genre that they might not have experienced before, that would be another aspect of a gap. And so both those resources and those gaps, they would shape the choices that you would be making in terms of how many times to read, how to support them while they're reading, what to do before they read, and how to tackle the text afterwards as a group with post-reading. So all of those things are really important to take into consideration. And so you're probably thinking, okay, but I need actual activities. So you've given me ways to think about it, but really I just need a menu of options. Well, some researchers in the 90s came up with a menu of options. Fitzgerald, Graves, and there's some others who did work with them. They did research on, for those teachers in K through 12, this comes out of K through 12, for those teachers in K through 12 who scaffold reading experiences for their students, which of the scaffolding activities work the best? And they came up with a list, a concrete list. It's like a menu. There's a pre-reading menu, a during reading, and a post-reading menu. They're not in any way, when they hand you the menu, the menu of SREs, SREs. They're not suggesting that you eat everything on the menu every day. Just like when you go to a restaurant, you're not expected to choose everything on the menu, but rather you choose 1 or 2 things for pre-reading, 1 or 2 things for during reading, 1 or 2 things for post-reading. So they came up with this list, and you have in your Canvas modules, you might even have it in your hand right now, you've got that list of pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading. But you'll notice it uses the word adapted, and that's because I actually, from my own experience, and it might be because of having worked with adult learners for so long, I actually can add some ideas that I think are highly successful as well. And so what you have in your SRE text, that list, I think it's called an outline template, you have not just the original ideas that Fitzgerald and Graves and others came up with, but you've also got some additional ideas from me. Now, if you want to take away what I'm suggesting and you want to only focus on what they found through their 1990s research, you can also find that because later in this this week's module, you will also see one of the original articles that they published on SREs, and it's got that list. And you'll notice it's much shorter than the list that I gave you. So you've got that list there. You've got things like for pre-reading, pre-teach vocabulary. You've also got for pre-reading, pre-teach concepts. Now, this is a good time to take a moment and think about the difference. You might be thinking, but wait a minute, aren't they the same? Not really. I'm going to try to pull them apart for you, but I want you to know that it's not as clear-cut as I'm making it sound. And is it super important? No, it's not. But you do have to have the big picture. So when we pre-teach concepts, these are possibly new vocabulary words, but they can't be just taught with a one-word definition on the board. They're more than that. You need to say more to it. It's kind of like you need to dig down and really kind of bring this thing alive, because if they don't know this concept, they won't have access to the reading. They won't have entry into it. So that's concepts, and those are actually top down. Bottom up is vocabulary. Bottom up are these little words that they need access to, but the ideas you can express in just 1 or 2 words. Or students can quickly look up if they have a bilingual dictionary, or they have a bilingual partner who already knows the word and can express it. That's enough. That's enough. It's not a big, fluffy, abstract idea that they need access to get access to the text. So concepts are top down, and pre-teaching vocabulary is bottom up. Okay? So you've got that really nice list there. I suggest that you look over it. We'll be doing things with it, and especially for your post-reflection, we'll be doing something with it. So now you have an idea of how to structure, how to make choices, and you even have a menu of options. You can think about what kinds of things you could do with your students. Now, the next place that I want to jump is I want to talk about, I've seen a lot of experienced teachers teach, and I've seen a lot of developing teachers teach. And I've got a list here of 5 things that, it is 5, yes, it's 5. 5 things that experienced teachers tend to incorporate into their lessons. They're super powerful, and developing teachers don't tend to do it. So what I'm hoping is to tip the scales for you to really put these at the top of your mind, so that when you, even week 1, week 2, year 1, when you are teaching reading, you are drawing upon these really powerful approaches or strategies. The first I have here is jigsaws. And in this module, in this week's module, I actually have a video for you to watch so that you can kind of get a sense of what I mean by jigsaw. Just like if you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle in which the pieces fit together, a jigsaw is when you take something that's a whole and you break it into pieces and you give a piece to different people. And if students are going to make it whole again, they must collaborate. They must work together, okay? So one choice that experienced, effective teachers make with the teaching of reading is they consider, wait a minute, this social studies chapter or this reading that I need to have my students do is pretty long and pretty complicated. And you know, I could break it into 4 pieces. How about this? Instead of having everybody read this chapter tonight, what if I assign that table to read the first part, that table to read the second part, that table the third part, and this table the fourth part? So in other words, breaking it up, giving students a focused area to read, which can work really well for English language learners who get very tired easily reading. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't do a lot of reading. Obviously, we know with extensive reading they should. But I'm just suggesting another approach that could help with especially long readings. But there's a lot of reasons to use jigsaws, just other than that you've got a really long reading that you need your students to do. And that is because the only way that students can put the reading back together is if they talk about it. And that forces them to carry out negotiation of meaning and noticing. It forces them to speak with each other. Then they have the opportunity to notice if other people are producing it differently than they are. There's a chance that others won't understand them, which is perfect, because now they have a chance to negotiate that meaning and to rethink some of the assumptions that they've made about how English works. So think about, please, think about incorporating jigsaws into one way that you approach reading with your students. Another thing that really experienced teachers do that I'd like you to do as well is to use think alouds. What's a think aloud? A think aloud essentially is when you are reading aloud to students, but you're not just reading through fluently. You are almost letting your inner voice come out. So you might, for example, and you might be exaggerating a little bit, right? Chances are that the text that your students are reading, you could read easily, very quickly, and understand perfectly. So you might be exaggerating some places where you don't understand a little bit. So a lot of teachers use an overhead to do it, or a doc cam. You could be doing it a lot of different ways. You could have it up on the board if you don't have access to a doc cam. If you're teaching overseas, but you have access to a board, you could have a paragraph written out on the board. Believe it or not, that's the way a lot of English as a foreign language teachers, at least in Central America, teach reading. They teach it off of the board, and they have to handwrite it. So, and what you would be doing is you would be reading, and then you would be modeling what are you doing when you're reading. You're making connections. You're stopping to notice if you understood an idea or not. You are thinking through a vocabulary word that you're not sure about what it means. So you are acting that out. You're modeling that for students. Because the thing about reading is it's invisible, right? I started the last lesson, the last lecture, by pointing out to you that that often when we think of reading, at least in the general population, we think of it as just this leisurely, solo, passive activity. But actually, when we're reading, especially if we're reading something that's just above our level, we are working hard. We are making connections. We're understanding what something means. We're looking back for the meaning of something. We're looking for additional ideas. And we're looking for those main ideas, for example. And so what you can do with a think aloud is to bring that so that it's transparent to the students, so that they can actually see it. They can see you thinking. and you can model the ways that you want them to think. So I highly encourage you to use think alouds in your practice. Context clues. Here's my personal opinion, that one of the most powerful things we can do for students when we're teaching them to read is how to approach words that they don't know. Now, some teachers, especially new teachers, what they will do is they will assign students to read a paragraph or a page or an essay, and they might even say, make a list of all the words you don't know. The thing is, that's not how powerful readers approach vocabulary that they don't know. They do one of two things. They either look for context clues or they skip them. If they can't figure it out from the context clues, they skip them and they move on. So if you are tempted to have your students over and over again, it's okay every once in a while, but over and over again to make a list of words that they don't know or to mark them or highlight them, whatever you do, you're actually taking them in the opposite direction of what good readers do. Good readers look for context clues or they skip them. Okay, so let's talk a moment about context clues. I think personally a lot of teachers don't teach context clues because they don't know how they work. They don't really know what kinds of clues that they are teaching their students to look for. And so one thing for you to know, and I've got in our modules for this week, I've got a place for you to look, and that is an example of a context clues activity. It will just give you a sense, just that worksheet. I don't expect you to do the worksheet, but it will get you thinking about the different kinds of clues that exist in a sentence. So most of the time, when students are looking for a meaning of a word, if there is a clue, it's within the sentence that the word is in. So you go to that original sentence. If it's not there, there is a chance that if you read on either side, you go to the sentence before, you go to the sentence after, that there will be a clue. But usually, if there is one, and there isn't always, but if there is one, it's in the sentence that they're in. What kinds of clues? Sometimes you can look, the word itself, there might be a built-in definition of it. There might be a comma and then a built-in definition, or a hyphen and a built-in definition. Sometimes there are examples of it. So maybe there's this word they don't know and then it says a list of examples. If they know what the examples are, they might be able to guess what the meaning is. Maybe the word that they don't know is some kind of tool, and then the rest of the sentence says what the tool does. They might be able to guess from that, for example. Sometimes it's contrast. Something like Gina loves to read nonfiction, but she abhors reading comic books. So if a student doesn't know what abhors mean, but they know that but is a contrast word, okay, they know Gina loves reading nonfiction, but she abhors reading comic books. Okay, so now but tells me there's a contrast there. I know what love means. Abhor must be the opposite. So what I just did is kind of give you a sense of the basic kinds of context clues that come up. And I firmly believe it is your job to teach your students to look for any clues, if there are any, and to get better at reading those clues, making sense of them, and using them. And so you can do activities. You can, whenever you're doing a reading with students and there's a word that you think they probably don't know, but there's a wonderful context clue, you could remind students about how this kind of context clue, maybe it's examples or contrast, whatever it is, remind them how this works. Have them go to the sentence and see if they can figure out what that word probably means. So you can do lots of examples with them and encouraging them to do that on their own. Okay, so that's context clues. Reading strategies. you know from our talk the last time that one thing that really powerful readers do is they use lots of strategies to make meaning. That is a really powerful tool. So you need to be encouraging students to use strategies, teaching them to students, encouraging them, and whenever possible, reinforcing reading strategies. Now let's talk about teacher talk, especially newly developing teacher talk. One thing that I did when I was a new teacher, and I hear other new teachers do as well, when we would be working on reading, and if I asked a question like, what do you think this word means? Let's go back to a context clues example. What do you think this word means? Just look at the sentence without using your dictionary. What do you think it means? A student raises their hand and says, I think it means X. And the old me, the newly developing teacher me, would say, you're right, correct. Now, does that give students anything they can take with them to the next reading or take with them to the next time they read without me to assist them? It doesn't. So you need to reinforce reading strategies with your teacher talk. Say, you are absolutely right. So, how did you get that answer? Where was the clue? You need to, wherever possible, to be reinforcing those strategies. And then name the strategy. Okay, everybody, so Bill just used the context clue of example. That's a powerful strategy. So it sounds like kind of motivational speaking. It is. You're really motivating students to use whatever tools they have developed so far in how to read. So reinforce those strategies with your teacher talk. And finally, teaching grammar from patterns. Okay, so one of the things that we know is that when we approach grammar with students, that one of the most powerful ways that we can approach grammar is to teach it when it's evident in their text, when they're exposed to it, they're making sense with it, whether they understand the grammar fully or not, or whether they can explain it or not. And so I highly suggest, whether you're teaching adults, or you're teaching fifth graders, wherever you're teaching, if you're teaching English language learners and you're putting readings in front of them, wherever possible, get them to notice how the grammar works, even if it's almost an offhand comment. So something like if you put a history reading in front of students, and part of your pre-reading might be to say, what tense is this written in? What tense? What verb tense? And then someone raises their hand and says, it looks like it's all in past tense. And then you might ask, why is it in past tense? Because it's about an event that happened in the past. That's why it uses past tense. And so, wherever possible, exploit the readings that you are putting in front of students to teach grammar. Now, if you are teaching in a program, whether that's with adults or whether that's you're doing tutoring with K through 12 students, and so you're not obligated to use a certain curriculum, whether you're teaching overseas and you're not required to use a certain curriculum, the more flexibility you have, the more I encourage you, if you are going to explicitly teach grammar, that you teach it from the readings that you are putting in front of students. And if you think about this for a moment, this is kind of a spoiler alert for writing, but if you think about it, if the reading you're putting in front of students, you're getting them to notice how the structure works, why it uses the tense it uses, why it forms sentences the way that it does, then you're perfectly setting them up for post-reading writing. You're perfectly setting them up for the writing that they might do in that same way. So if you're giving students a history text to read, then what are they doing for post-reading? It probably is some history writing. Maybe they're tackling another subject, but they're writing in the same way, that kind of thing. So these are some really, really powerful kind of ways that you can approach reading in your class that you might be tempted to not include as a developing teacher. A couple of issues I want to talk about. One thing that I remember from my early days teaching reading, and I originally taught adults, and the first skill that I was assigned to teach was reading. So this is way back, like week 3 in my experience. But I remember suddenly realizing that when you're teaching the skill of reading, you end up asking a lot of questions. And I noticed, I started to pay attention to what kinds of questions I was asking and how I addressed those questions, how students went about answering them. And one thing that we know, and I know, is that you need to think about wait time. And when you ask questions about a reading as part of your, say, post-reading, you need to give students ample time to think, and often they're doing translation in their head, and so you need to give them ample time for that. I can guarantee you the first few times that you wait quite a while, you'll feel very uncomfortable. But just know that if it's the appropriate time, that it's not uncomfortable for the students necessarily, okay? Another thing I started thinking about is, what do I do when a student raises their hand and I call on them and they don't have the right answer? What are some things I can do? Well, what I used to do in the beginning was I would simply call on another student. But one useful strategy you can build in so that your class feels more like it belongs to your students too, not just to you calling the shots, is to make part of your classroom culture, part of your classroom rules. If you're called on and you don't know the answer or you didn't get the answer correct, you need to call on another student to help you. So you put that onus on the students so that they can reach out to another student. It also is a really good pattern. It's teaching them a social strategy, that the teacher is not the only place that they can go for assistance. If there's 14 other students in the class, they have 14 other places that they can go for assistance. Another thing that I remember thinking about around questions is that I spent a lot of time me asking the whole group and then one person in the group answering and everyone listening. And I have to tell you, that gets boring fast. So think about some other options, like what we call in K-12, think, pair, share. Think, pair, share, in which you toss out a question, you ask students to think about it. Maybe they are just thinking about it, or maybe you have them doing some free writing about it, or maybe you encourage them, if they want to write something down, they can, but they don't have to. Think, pair, share. The pair part is they turn to, in K through 12, we call them elbow partners. I still call them elbow partners. They turn to their elbow partner and they share what they think and they hear what their partner thinks. And then think, pair, share. Share with either with the rest of their table, with the whole class, that kind of thing. But you have this gradual doing some thinking on your own and then coming out and talking with the whole group. So you can build in some other patterns there. It doesn't have to be simply you throwing out those questions. And as we talked about before, with reading, you need to think about the kinds of levels of questions that you're giving. For beginners, questions that they can go directly back to the text and find the answer, that's kind of a low-level question. That's a surface question, a thin question. But for a beginner, that's challenging. And then there's deeper level questions where they have to be thinking about something that can't be found in the text. An example from my very first quarter when I was teaching, very first semester actually, when I was teaching reading, I remember one of the first times I put a thick question in front of my beginning students. I was required to cover a series of fairy tales with them, folk tales, actually I should call them folk tales. They were from around the world, and we were doing intensive pre-reading, dream reading, post-reading with the students around those each folktale. A lot of the questions, because they were beginner, were thin level questions. And after we finished the last one, I gave them a post-reading question to answer on their own. And that is, what do you think the meaning is across all of these folktales? Is there a meaning that we can take from all of them? And I still remember one of my students' answers. The student said, "Too big lucky hurt me, I think. Too big lucky hurt me, I think." And when I stopped him to talk to him about what he meant by that, to make sure I was clear, he meant that in all of the stories, someone found a genie in a bottle, or they found magic stones, or they found magic beans, and they got these tremendous things, but also some bad things happened too. So in his mind, if you get a lot of luck, it can cause big problems. So that's what he was expressing, but that's a thick question. So I'm sure you will spend a lot of time thinking about questions, but I hope, unlike me, you're more quick to really use questions in different ways, give students different access to how they answer them, maybe answering them to themselves, answering them to a partner, answering them in small groups, and then making sure that you give that appropriate wait time. Another thing, the last issue I want to talk about is appropriate reading material for beginners. One thing that is a real struggle is to come up with the kind of reading that is just right. And in K through 12, we call it just right reading, just right level for your beginning English language learners. Whether they're beginning, because that's age appropriate, they're beginning first graders, they're beginning third graders, they're adults who, especially if they didn't learn to read in the first language. How do you come up with the reading material that's just right for them? One powerful way to do that is to let them create the reading material. How do we do this? We do it through something called LEA, Language Experience Approach. Language Experience Approach, there's different ways to do it. There's one way, let me tell you a wonderful example that comes right from here in Spokane, from working in an adult classroom with students who have very low levels of English and who previously didn't know how to read and write in their first language. And a teacher shared this example with me, a really powerful and effective example. The students met in a building in Spokane, and what they did, because they all traveled many days a week to that area, they traveled by bus, they traveled by foot, they kind of knew that area. And so what the teacher did was to take them on a field trip. And they went on a field trip and they walked the neighborhood to see what there was. What kinds of restaurants? What are the houses like? And as they were walking, the teacher was talking with them in English and teaching new vocabulary. So they're having this experience. There's language attached. I'm sure that they were thinking about things themselves too that didn't have necessarily English attached to it. But the teacher was helping them bridge, attaching English. They all came back to the classroom, and on the board, the teacher asked them, what is in our neighborhood? What is here? What did we see? And then as the students were saying sentences in English, the teacher was writing those. And she was not correcting the grammar. She was leaving it as is. And so she elicited from the students a paragraph of information. And that became a reading for the students, one of the first readings of that length that they did. So that is a great example of language experience approach, and it's a wonderful way to create reading material that's at that just right level for your beginner readers. So that's one way you can do that. There's lots of different ways it can play out, and I've got in the module, in Canvas, I've got some video examples for you to take a look at. Okay, so here's what I hope. I hope that you are in a completely different place than you were before you watched this lecture. That you have a sense about how to structure your lesson. You have a sense of the kinds of strategies that you might very likely leave out, but you really should include. You should keep them on your menu of options, and the kinds of issues that might come up and how you might address them. Where do you go from here? There's some readings to do from the textbook. See how the ideas connect with, add to, are completely additional ideas than the ones that I suggested. You have videos to take a look at. How does a jigsaw work? Examples of, for example, a teacher talking through how he approaches pre-reading. You've got examples of entire lessons, reading lessons to watch, pre-reading, during reading, post-reading, the entire thing. So my goal, one of my goals for you, as you are reading, as you are watching those videos, that this information kind of stands up for you and makes even more meaning. That this information stands up, makes even more meaning, and especially from the videos that are taken directly from class examples, I want you to actually just absorb what your own reading instruction can look like, okay? And then, when you've absorbed all that, watch the 30-minute video of Christina's class and meet us in the discussion. And let's talk through what you see her doing, what kinds of choices you see her making. Okay, I'll see you in the discussion.